Today, we're diving into a story involving espionage, international intrigue, government leaks, and because this is Canada, a politely worded 800-page report. It all started with intelligence leaks, alleging that the Chinese government had interfered in the last Canadian election. The claims were that Beijing had tried to sway the election for Trudeau, had possibly co-opted sitting MPs, and most damningly, that the Canadian government might have known, shrugged its shoulders, and looked the other way. This led to public outrage, parliamentary pressure, and the eventual formation of the Foreign Interference Commission. The commission was led by Justice Marie-Josée Hogue, whose job was to investigate these claims and to figure out whether Canada's democracy was compromised. But just when we thought this was all going to be about China, the plot thickened when the Canadian government accused India of assassinating Sikh nationalist Hardeep Singh Nijjar on Canadian soil. A true diplomatic scandal.
Indian-born Canadian citizen Hardeep Nijjar was fatally shot in his pickup truck in June of 2023.
As Canada expelled an Indian diplomat, so India summoned Canada's High Commissioner to the Foreign Ministry and gave him 5 days' notice to leave the country.
Canada has provided credible, irrefutable evidence of ties between agents of the government of India and a murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil.
In response, disinformation from India flooded the Canadian internet. And then, Russia was accused by the US government of secretly funding sympathetic podcasters via a Canadian company called Tenet Media. So the government broadened Justice Hogue's mandate to include India and Russia alongside China. After a year of hearings, investigation, and expert testimony, Justice Hogue has released the Commission's long-awaited final report. And according to Hogue's findings, foreign interference isn't just about targeted attacks or manipulation of MPs. It's actually about something much bigger. It's about the vulnerability of our entire information ecosystem, or as she put it,
distinguishing what is true from what is false is becoming increasingly difficult. And the consequences are, in my view, extraordinarily harmful. The impact of traditional methods should not be underestimated, but the greatest threat, the one that I believe threatens the very existence of our democracy, is disinformation.
This is a huge deal, especially at a time when the US government is actively hostile to global efforts to combat disinformation.
Fourth, we need to break up the entire toxic censorship industry that has arisen under the false guise of tackling so-called mis- and disinformation.
And even threatening to criminally prosecute researchers studying it. Which brings us to the Media Ecosystem Observatory, and my opportunity to testify before the Commission last year. It was an intense session of questioning, alongside Angus Bridgman and Peter Lowen, my collaborators at MEO, which studies the way information flows through the Canadian internet. Our main message that day was that government and the media spend way too much time panicking about individual pieces of mis- and disinformation, instead of looking at the overall health of our public digital sphere. While our research determined that Chinese interference likely didn't swing the results of the 2021 election, we did argue that there's a bigger problem here.
When we set up this project, in part we were doing so to push back against the over-indexing or the almost fetishization post-2016 in the US of the power of foreign interference to surgically shape our democracy and our information ecosystem. Part of why we wanted to push back against that is because the information ecosystem, as we've been talking about, is a far more complex and still very unknown thing. And we felt we weren't paying enough attention to the design and incentives and nature of that digital ecosystem in Canada, and that is a precondition for understanding the vulnerability of foreign interference within it.
We need to look in the mirror and ask ourselves how the design and use of our unregulated digital ecosystem shapes the character of our democracy. To do this, at the Media Ecosystem Observatory, we track about 4,000 accounts across 7 platforms. It turns out that these accounts from journalists, politicians, and influencers make up about 90% of the Canadian content that actually gets seen by Canadians. That's right, the top 10% of accounts make up over 90% of the Canadian content that's seen by us. While anyone can speak on social media, the reality is that very few of us are actually heard. So here is what the Canadian ecosystem looks like. This shows clusters of influential Canadians who talk about similar things on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. The size of the dot shows how influential and important they are, and how close the two dots are together is an indicator if they discuss the same things. So what do we learn from studying this, from looking at the ecosystem as a whole? Well, first, trust in and consumption of traditional media in Canada is plummeting. Our 2019 election report was called Lessons in Resilience because Canadians were protected from disinformation by their high levels of consumption and trust in traditional media. The theory goes here that even if you read or hear something sensational on the internet, the reaction you have to it is tempered by a legacy news source that you might trust. But that's all changed. We don't really consume legacy media anymore. Second, we're getting more polarized. And this polarization is in part determined by, you guessed it, social media. Polarization is not necessarily bad, of course. Lots of positive change happens in a democracy because we disagree with one another. But when we actively dislike each other because of these differences, that's when polarization starts to hurt society. And that's on the rise here.
I do not understand how you as reporters and as new anchors can sit behind the desk and tell people lies.
Third, the Canadian information ecosystem is largely shaped by America. During the pandemic, for example, we identified that 53% of the vaccine misinformation in Canada originated from the US. It got here through what we call misinformation pathways on social media. And last year, when Meta banned news links on their platform, we saw a loss of 8 million views of journalism a day. Fourth, the combination of easily deployable bots and new generative AI tools are reshaping the information ecosystem and providing new places of acute vulnerability.
The ability to create accounts, automated accounts that look like people easily and cheaply, and the ability to have them create their own content using generative AI without human input. Those two things have scaled the capacity to deceive.
And finally, influencers and podcasters are the new dominant actors in the Canadian media ecosystem. This change has empowered a wide range of new voices, which is great, but it has also platformed and legitimized some influencers who spread information to massive audiences. We found that American podcasts funded by the Russian government talked about Canada over 1,000 times in just the last 2 years. So is Canada vulnerable to disinformation? Absolutely we are. We knew that, and Justice Hogue confirmed it. But the real problem isn't just disinformation. It's also about how the design of our social platforms incentivizes it. This means that foreign interference isn't just a national security issue. It's also about our resilience against false information. But here's the kicker. Under the guise of free speech, platforms are now actively removing the very safeguards they had in place for this problem. This includes basic content moderation, programs that protect election integrity, and transparency tools that are simply essential to tackling the spread of disinformation. And they're doing this all while calling researchers like us the real threat to democracy. So what now? Well, maybe we should start with our sovereignty. When Canada attempts to curtail foreign interference in the next election, do we really think Elon Musk is going to comply? Or will he be more likely to amplify disinformation, like he's already doing in the UK and Germany? And perhaps more importantly, with the unprecedented alignment of the US government and tech power interests, will countries even be able to govern their digital spaces at all? Fighting disinformation, as Justice Hogue says we must, demands that we try.